Hello, welcome to the Human Rights Defender podcast. In this episode, we're going to be speaking about digital rights. We're joined by an expert in the field of digital rights, Andrej Petrovski, Director of Technology at Share Foundation, partner and a great friend of the organisation as well. And for the purpose of this interview, the author or co-author with civil rights defenders of Human Rights in the Pandemic report. Before we get into the thick of the actual findings and the report itself, how are you? How are you and your colleagues getting through these challenging times?
We are lucky to have been vaccinated, at least a few of us. So we are kind of hopeful that in the near future we'll be able to get back to the office and continue life as it used to be before. Now, thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to basically participate in anything that CRD is organizing, because I think that the synergy between you as an organization and us as an organization is always a great way of cooperation.
And it's worth mentioning we have actually collaborated on several projects, including the Internet Freedoms project when the pandemic began, and we'll touch upon some of the findings there as well. But before we get into this, set the scene for us a bit, perhaps for viewers that are not so familiar with the region and what's going on here. What's the overall picture for digital rights and the violations in the Western Balkans?
Well, I would, if I have to describe it using one word, it would be unawareness. So we are living in a region that in the past, let's say, few years, is going through a process of digitalization that is unfortunately not really followed with the proper measures for securing all these aspects of the lives of our citizens that are being digitalized. In such a system, speaking about Serbia, but also other countries in the region, and the lack of awareness on the side of the citizens themselves, the states do have some space to manipulate with different aspects of these systems for different reasons. In most cases, it's lack of capacity and lack of knowledge, and in many cases, data in this system have been compromised because of trivial and I'd say stupid reasons. So we live in part of the world that aspires to become part of the EU, to integrate into Europe in a more, let's say, political but also technological, economic and different ways. But unfortunately, I think that we're still behind, and I think that the source of it all is basically starting and ending with rule of law.
Getting into the report a bit, talk us through the process, the methodology, if you could touch upon how you approached it, and in general some of the key findings overall.
Well, Share Foundation has been conducting digital rights violations monitoring since 2014 in Serbia. Since a few years ago, we started the monitoring of these violations regionally. Together with the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network in 6 countries. Those are Serbia, North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Romania and Hungary. And on purpose we tried to cover 3 EU and 3 non-EU countries just to see the differences. And in that context we really found out that basically there are patterns that repeat in both EU and non-EU countries, meaning that digital rights are still something that's not being addressed adequately in the EU as well. Having said that, that puts us in a position to work together as a region, as a broader region of Southeast Europe, to address all these issues in a way that could bring us all benefits. So the methodology of this report in particular was not that loosely, basically quite strongly related to the methodology that we use in the digital rights monitoring, whereas in this case we mostly focus on HRDs, basically human rights defenders themselves, and in our regular monitoring we do monitor other parts of society as well. So HRDs, and when I say HRDs, I mean activists, online media, civil society organizations, etc., as broad as the term can be, did face challenges at the beginning of the pandemic due to the change of paradigm, change of the rule of the games, due to the fact that they had to start working remotely, which was not really that common. I mean, obviously, especially with media, there is always someone who reports from abroad or works remotely, but now we have over 90% of people in this sector working not from the office, especially for small organizations that don't really have strong infrastructure or don't have licenses for collaborative software, etc. That did pose a serious challenge. On the other side, the way the states handled it was quite poor. I could have some level of understanding due to the fact that it was all ad hoc, that it was something that happened really fast, that nobody could actually anticipate that this would happen on this level. But on the other side, we have history of different types of violations by the state. So their credit was not too big, and we saw different situations in which countries basically tried to control the flow of information, because that information in times of crisis can be deemed as a scarcity in a way. People need information in order to make some daily decisions, whereas the country needs to control the information, the establishment needs to control the information in order to preserve some sort of normality, if we could call it that.
Without going into the politics, are you saying that to some degree it was expected, just looking at the trend and the way that they were approaching digitalization, it became clear that they would maybe utilize this crisis to further strengthen their hold or something like that?
Absolutely. For example, the president of Serbia at the beginning of the pandemic said that they would follow, when Italy was the number one hit country in Europe, they would follow Italian phone numbers roaming around Serbia to see where these people go. And when the president goes to the public and says we're going to monitor the phone numbers without any insinuation of using a court order or having some legal ground to do it, then it feels a little bit weird. You know, it feels like, are you monitoring only Italian numbers or all the numbers? And then a few days later, he goes out and says that they do not, even if you leave your phone at home, then we'll be able to track you. And having said that, in a moment when we have thousands of biometric face recognition cameras being set up around the capital of Serbia, it does leave quite a bitter aftertaste in terms of our own basic human rights of privacy, how strong the grip of the state can be in such cases. And it is an unprecedented event, even for us. I mean, we as digital rights activists, first and foremost, do not really know how to balance these things, but I think that some basic principles of respecting the right to privacy of the citizens should be enforced, even in cases of crisis.
Sure. Let's stick on Serbia just a bit, and primarily because I found this really interesting table. Perhaps we can show it after on the screen, with recorded violations and breaches of various human rights issues, and particularly linked to the freedom of expression. And one thing that really stood out for me is that Serbia, practically what was recorded over the past year, more so, almost double than in the other countries put together. Was this trend anticipated, and why particularly? And again, we could put this out. Why particularly does it come down to pressures related to expression and activities on the internet?
Well, I think that in Serbia, the case is very specific. I mean, it is the biggest country in the region. It is comparably one of the most developed countries in the region. The extent of digitalization in Serbia is the furthest in the process. So all these factors do give some space for this type of trends. On the other side, we are witnessing a more and more authoritarian mode of government here compared to maybe other countries. On the other side, Serbia has the highest number of investigative media compared to other countries. So the size of the country as such does dictate to some extent the trends that you mentioned. So I wouldn't say that Serbia is the worst. I would say that Serbia is most eventful due to the colorfulness of the scene. There is a few very strong investigative media outlets who address issues like the consistency of the numbers of deaths and infected people. That is a very, very, very strong case. We did not see a similar case coming from another investigative media. I don't know if the investigative media in the other countries dealt with these issues on such level, but in Serbia we have investigative media who are quite critical of the government, which they should be absolutely. And I think that is one of the sources of friction that is generated and more visible in Serbia compared to other countries.
One thing particularly that was highlighted, and this actually came up in April of this year at the onset of the crisis. The Stanford Internet Observatory found that Twitter had removed 8,000 accounts associated with the ruling SNS party in Serbia. My question is, first of all, how do you understand this phenomenon? Because at the time, they actually, if you recall, they actually removed a bunch of other accounts, also from Saudi Arabia and Egypt and some other countries. But Serbia was the highest actually at that time. How do you see this trend, particularly taking place on Twitter? And I ask you particularly because in several of the countries that we work in, Twitter is still seen as some sort of space of open discussion and a window of free space. We know in Turkey, for instance, when Twitter was locked down, how much of a revolt that really created in civil society and freedom of speech and so on. Do you feel that in some other ways the regime here and in the region has been able to sort of infiltrate this space and really sort of change the narrative on these platforms?
Yeah, I mean, if it's an open space, then everyone's welcome. So to start with that, but as I mentioned before, Serbia has gone furthest when we speak about digitalization, unfortunately, in this aspect as well. There was over 8,000 basically puppet accounts, fake accounts, used centrally and managed centrally by the ruling party in Serbia, which Twitter detected through their algorithm and then basically removed all these accounts. The fact remains that someone invested a lot of resources to create and manage these accounts, and the purpose thereof is to control the narrative. So if you have an influx of 8,000 people into an open forum, which Twitter could be considered in this context, then your dominance in that regard is quite strong. On the other side, if you see all these particular profiles, their role is mostly amplifying and smearing, depending on the side. So amplifying the messages your own party promotes, and then smearing everyone else who is not basically in line with what you propagate as a political option. I think that on the other side, the Twitter community in Serbia is quite well now trained. I'd say it's a very close and tiny community, unfortunately. So they recognize these artificial, the term in English is astroturfing, when we speak about using this type of accounts to amplify or smear something. But in Serbia, I think that even the community that's on Twitter, the independent, let's call it that, community that's not affiliated with one or the other, the position or the opposition, did recognize those, what we call in Serbia, bots. On the other side, the Serbian Progressive Party is not the only one who has these types of accounts, though everyone else is incomparable in numbers when it comes to measuring how many has the opposition or which part of the opposition compared to what the Progressive Party has. And that's basically due to the resources that the party possesses. I mean, it's much wealthier compared to the other parties, has much more human resources to employ some people who maybe are employed by some state companies or state institutions to work on Twitter, basically to manage 10, 15, 20 accounts, because I'm positive that there was not 8,000 people managing 8,000 accounts.
Right. Moving on to surveillance, this was another important chapter of the publication. How you mentioned already the thousands of facial recognition cameras. Not much is known about how many there are, what the purpose is, how long they're going to be there for, what exactly the case is. Give us a bit of insight from what is known.
Yeah, the worst case scenario basically is that they're here to stay. and that's something that we've been fighting against for 2 years now. First of all, it was weird the way the project was promoted. The then Minister of Interior, Nebojša Stefanović, was really proud of the project, and they went themselves publicly and said, we are very proud that every corner of the city will be covered with face recognition technology. They were motivated basically by a case publicly named Countrymen here in Serbia. It was a case of a hit and run basically, where the perpetrator was found in China a few weeks after the crime happened. And it
through facial recognition.
Through facial recognition, the Chinese government managed to find him in less than 48 hours. And I think that kind of inspired the authorities here to try and implement similar technology in similar technology in Belgrade, produced by the Chinese company Huawei. When it comes to Share Foundation, we're not really geopolitical in that regard. Even if the government procured these equipment from another partner, we would have similar stance. But now we're looking at Belgrade as basically the first capital, the first city in Europe to have its entire territory covered with biometric mass surveillance. And that is generally a very dangerous predicament. It can set a precedent that can be replicated, first of all in the region, because we've seen in the past different authoritarian techniques that have been replicated between the countries. So if it works in Belgrade, it could work in Banja Luka, Sarajevo, Skopje, or Zagreb, Podgorica, or wherever. Other countries in the region have been negotiating with Huawei and other vendors as well to procure similar equipment, but Belgrade for now... Well, there have been, there have been media articles on those talks. Greece as well, Croatia as well, North Macedonia as well. Montenegro, Podgorica is already implementing something, even though we're not sure whether it does include face recognition technology or just license plate recognition. A few countries in the region do plan on implementing some sort of artificial intelligence technology that will have the purpose of identifying people and objects in the streets. Now, with Belgrade, we asked the police, because they were bragging about it, we sent them freedom of information request regarding this project in terms of what is the technology they use, what's the system of checks and balances, how do we prevent abuse in these types of technology, when using these types of technology, because we have history of technology, especially surveillance technology, being abused by the state in Serbia. So we wanted to know what are the mechanisms that the ministry provides for basically disabling abuse. On the other side, we wanted to know how much it costs, how many cameras will be set up, and in which locations, and is there any justification for the particular locations, especially from the angle of data protection, the GDPR and the national law on personal data protection. For using this type of technology, there is a mandatory what is called data protection impact assessment. The ministry has done 2 versions now, both submitted to the Commissioner for Data Protection in Serbia, and both rejected by the Commissioner, because what the ministry has failed repeatedly to do is to prove that this type of technology, this type of surveillance, mass surveillance technology, is necessary, absolutely necessary, and absolutely proportional to the context. Now, I, as someone who lives in this city, do not feel that Belgrade is not a secure city. I very much feel secure and safe here. The reports that I've seen done by people who deal with public security do not indicate anything extraordinary, no risk of terrorism, no risk of, I mean, there are obviously some risks, those risks are very, very marginal. There is obviously street thefts of cars, etc., bicycles, but I don't think that is proportionate technology, proportional mechanism of mitigating petty crimes in the streets by depriving the entire population of this city of their right to privacy. So we have nowadays the ministry does not speak much about it. Basically, they don't say anything at all.
They avoid the questions.
Well, They avoid appearing when it comes to. We've invited them to public discussion because they did not organize any public discussion. So we wanted to basically be inclusive and ask them to come and tell us why do they think that this technology is absolutely necessary in Belgrade. But nobody showed up. They did not respond to our calls. On the other side, when Deutsche Welle was interviewing the president of Serbia, I think it was Deutsche Welle, it was German media, interviewing the president of Serbia regarding, among other things, this technology, he said, I think that's only for traffic. So basically they're trying to spin the story as something that's not really happening. Out of the 2 impact assessments, we did find out some things. We did find out that at this point there is 8,000 cameras that have been procured. That includes cameras on the poles, in the streets, also like police car cameras, also body cams for policemen, etc. So mobile cameras also.
Not all facial recognition.
All of them do have the possibility of using face recognition. All of them procured from Huawei. So we are entering a situation in which we import a lot of Chinese technology with capabilities of face recognition to be used in the streets of Belgrade. Basically leaving no corner in this city that's not covered by this technology.
It's quite remarkable. I'm sure you remember in the West, a lot of the media was caught the attention of what was happening in the eastern region the western region of China, in Urumqi and Xinjiang. There's these parallels to Black Mirror and so on because these facial recognition cameras. And here we are actually in an EU accession state. These things being implemented. Do you feel it's an issue which is underreported?
I think so at the moment, but I see some strong initiatives in Europe, in the EU first and foremost, some of which we are part as an organization through the EDRI, the European Digital Rights Coalition of Digital Rights Organizations. So we had a petition called Reclaim Your Face. We managed to gather a few, I think almost 15,000 signatures from I mean, most of these signatures actually came from Belgrade, over 10,000 were from Belgrade. So meaning that here there is already, that we have managed somehow to make this topic public priority when it comes, people can relate to it. And that is very, very important to us to build a community around this issue, because this is not only our issue, it's the issue of each and everyone who basically lives in Belgrade or any other city in Serbia. We can expect that this technology can be implemented in other cities as well. We don't know why it wouldn't be the case, especially the bigger cities. In Europe, there are different initiatives. Now, this issue has become a European civic initiative, meaning that it has a period of 1 year to gather 1 million signatures from citizens of the EU in order for it to be considered by the Commission and the Parliament. I hope that that's going to be a success, and I hope that Europe, as the EU as such, will develop some sort of, let's say, standard for when and how this technology can be used. The Council of Europe also published some guidelines in terms of face recognition. So this is the topic of today and tomorrow. So this is the topic that we are all in Europe are going to, and I think globally as well, but in Europe especially, will be dealing in the next few years. There are examples of cities in the US, like San Francisco, that have banned use of face recognition, and we hope that Europe will follow with that example. And afterwards, Serbia. Unfortunately, I don't see any other mechanism of talking to the government at this point about not using this type of technology. They have spent a lot of money on it.
Sure.
We don't know how much because they wouldn't say, but we can presume that it's
here to stay.
It is here to stay. Unfortunately, we are going to do everything in our power, legally and as activists and as people who know technology, to address all the risks and all the issues, and hope that at some point on the other side of the table at the Ministry of Interior, there'll be someone who will understand why this is bad. Because we take things for granted. We cannot take democracy in Serbia. We cannot take democracy in general for granted, because once you implement this type of system, you have to think that even when you're off power, when you lose power, and at some point it will happen, it happens with everyone, that the next ones that will come, will have the same resources that you have established, and can use them against your civic initiatives, against your political platform, in the way that you want to use against your political opponents. And in order to deal with that, you basically surveil all your citizens in the capital. I think that's kind of, it is very, very suffocating feeling when you know that every time you're in the street that there is a database that records your face.
Another section of the report actually deals with digital tips, and of course in these precarious times it's really important for, as you mentioned already, for organizations to get with the trends, to understand potential risks and opportunities at the end of the day. Can you give a bit of an insight of what sort of things should human rights defenders and organizations be implementing?
Yeah, this was a particularly challenging part of the report. It is easy to analyze findings in terms of this happened and that happened and this and that, this government is more restrictive, the other one is slightly more liberal, etc. But when it comes to recommending people who are in aggravated position, who are being attacked essentially, how to protect themselves, does increase the level of responsibility. It's not a mere report. It just, you're giving people directions towards how they manage their devices, their data, etc. So for us, it was really important to focus on things that we think are not only quite basic in a bad way, they're quite essential. Let's call them that. So I think that in general, a very noted problem. It is noted rather, the report as something subtle. It's the fact that we lack quite a lot of media literacy in the ecosystem of human rights defenders. So the initial recommendation in that regard is that we have to deal with basically increasing the level of digital and media literacy in our own community, in organizations that don't necessarily deal with digital rights, in organizations that deal with, let's say, Roma issues or minority issues or LGBTQ issues or women's rights, organizations that are slightly more traditional when it comes to the human rights they're dealing with.
Why media literacy? What role does this play in?
Media literacy as such plays the role of raising the awareness of the risks that can happen in the digital environment. It's good to be practical and tell them install this app and use this service, etc. But I think that what we need with human rights defenders, with activists, with organizations, with media as well, is the recognition from their side that this risks are realistic and things can happen in a matter of hours. Your website can be down, your communications can be intercepted, etc. Many of these people, very brave and courageous people, try to ignore that and think that it does not exist because they see it as an obstacle in their work, and that's entirely, we completely understand that. But our role as a digital rights organization, and we managed to, I hope, articulate that in this publication, is to incentivize them, to make them aware how important the digital aspect of their work is. What are all the risks, and what are the what types of services they can use in order to cover the essential aspects of their work. How to communicate securely, how to manage their passwords, how to protect their email accounts or social media accounts, etc. All these basic steps, very practical basic steps, are quite essential into building the broader infrastructure of an organization or a group of people that work on a particular issue. So I think that this report in that regard could be quite useful to, especially to organizations who do not really incorporate digital aspects in their work, have not gone through digital security trainings, etc. I think that is one of the biggest values. I mean, obviously, the general retrospective of what happened in the region during the first part of the pandemic, basically the first year of the pandemic. But on the other side, I think that it's much more useful for our partners, our fellow human rights defenders, to basically become aware and start practicing some of the basic techniques of cybersecurity.
And do you think any of these risks have been particularly compounded by the pandemic, can I say, the emergency measures?
Those risks were always there. It's just that now, due to the pandemic, most of the communication that used to happen at the office, at a conference, at different fora that people interacted in physically, is now digital. So meaning the exposure has been increased quite dramatically. And that in those situations, you know, do you call your colleague, or do you use Signal, or what exactly do you do? What do you do in each particular scenario is very important. So if you live in a country where you know that communications are intercepted, and you can presume that in pretty much every country in the modern world nowadays, then when you speak with your colleague about work-related stuff, or you're, I don't know, organizing something, try to use Signal, because there is a substantially basically lower chance that the state will be able to intercept your communication.
What's next for you? What's next for Share? What are the...
Well, 2020 was work-wise for Share was quite fruitful. The digitalization of the work of all our partner organizations did increase the demand for our, let's say, expertise, and we think that that's going to continue in the future. Basically, we try to, through different channels, try to build the capacities and build the morale, first of all, in our community, broader community, to help people survive these last months. We published the survival toolkit, a package that included different content, but also I don't know, face masks that confuse the face recognition system and protect you from pollution, etc. So we tried to be creative in these difficult times to give people not only knowledge but also some sort of, I would say, entertainment. We played with different forms: video, audio, text, visual forms, etc. What's next is that we continue to deal with the primary focuses of our organizations. First and foremost, obviously, cybersecurity and mass surveillance. In this context, the cameras, the biometric mass surveillance project in Belgrade is definitely going to stay in our focus. Also, the issues related to digital security, we're currently building a toolkit for a sort of a troubleshooter, where everyone who is in trouble at a particular moment can quickly, through answering a few questions, identify the problem and seek solution or support. We will obviously continue to offer pro bono technical and legal aid to all our partner organizations who are in trouble. We will also tap into some new fields. Basically, for me personally, one of the things that I'd like to deal with most this year is biometric surveillance from the perspective of biotech. Maybe how DNA can be used for DNA as basically the principal component of the human being, the identity of the human being, can be sold or used or for the purposes of surveillance. So that will be a new and coming stream that we are going to be opening. Also, local issues related to Serbia, like for example the applications that are used in the educational system. The region as well is very important to us. As I mentioned before, the SE Digital Rights Network was established last year. We'll be continue to work in the region as well with partner organizations to increase their capacities. We hope that at some point this year we'll be able to continue or start having physical events in physical space. We are quite optimistic when it comes to the future in terms of I believe, now the weather is nice today, so maybe that's one of the sources of my optimism, but I really hope that we are kind of seeing the end of this state of emergency that in which we all lived in the past year.
The beginning of the end.
I think that those are the exact words that I would use. I think that now we're at the beginning of the end, and I'm really hopeful that what comes next is going to be at least slightly easier. We'll be always there to help. We'll be always there to provide advice. We'll be always there to give critique if that's necessary, if someone is doing something in not a good way. But in the end of the day, I think that digital rights are definitely the present and the future. So I think that our work will be ever more relevant.